Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Very happy to have you to talk about podcasting and how that fits into the digital marketing overlay and strategy for small, medium, large businesses. So today we have Marc. How we just practiced this. Marc Ronick.
Yes.
Ronick, awesome. So I'm super happy to hear you have you here and looking forward to your insights. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself for the students?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Marc Ronick, and I have been a podcaster for about 20 years now. So I was doing it when nobody understood what the heck I was talking about. I used to have to just say it's like radio, but it's on the internet, and that would suffice. But yeah, I've been doing this a long time. I've also been a TV producer, worked with some of the known networks out there, and yeah, podcasting has always been my passion. I've had different types of businesses. I've owned and or operated podcast networks, and most recently, right at the pandemic, right before it, I started a company called Ironic Media, and what we do is we produce podcasts and we consult podcasters. So some podcasters don't have the time or don't want to make the time to do all the production of their podcast, and then there are other people that are just looking for advice, guidance, ideas, a collaborative partner, and so we offer that as well. And yeah, this has just been my passion for pretty much all my life. So I'm loving that you asked me to do this. Thank you.
Awesome. That's amazing. So not one of the questions that we have planned, but kind of.
Kind
So
of.
what makes this a passion area for you? Or how did you get started in podcasting 20 years ago? Like I didn't even know that was a thing 20 years
Yeah.
ago.
Well, it's actually only 20 or so years old. So I was doing it just couple of years maybe after it really started. And what got me into it? Well, it goes back to what I just said earlier, talk radio. I was a huge fan of talk radio growing up in high school. My best friend and I, we used to listen to the local morning show there, and it was a thing, right? We loved it, and we would call them frequently. Our mission was to try to get them to laugh as much as possible, and we did, and so much so that they ended up inviting us to the radio station and basically walked out of the station and gave it to us for an hour and let us have our own radio show for an hour on a major Washington D.C. radio
Wow.
station. And I think that was it. Like after I got to be in that studio, I knew I wanted a microphone in front of me, and I knew I wanted to share whatever my passions were through a microphone and ultimately through podcasting. And the ironic part of all this is that I would say almost 10 years ago, yeah, something like that, 10 or so years ago, I was hired to be the business manager and a producer on a podcast that was hosted by that radio show that I was just referencing to you. One thing I left out was when I was in college, I even interned for that radio show. And
Wow.
what happened was their radio station changed formats and
Mhm.
they didn't have a home. So podcasting was just becoming a thing, and they decided, let's just do it on our own. Let's do a podcast. And I heard about it and I said, hey, it's your old intern. I know a thing or two about this. Do you want some help? And then they hired me soon after to be their business manager and a producer on the show. And that was a show that was generating, and which is astronomical numbers now when you think about it. They were generating basically at least 100,000 downloads a month on their podcast. And again, I mean, translating that now, when we think about, sometimes when we talk about inflation and we talk about how, the pricing changes over the years, now that's probably 3 or 4 times what, that would be what they'd be getting nowadays if they had started. So huge. And it was a huge opportunity for me because I was able to learn how to monetize something that wasn't really monetized yet because it was still so new and people were still trying to figure it out. So I got a great lesson that really prepared me for where I am today through that podcast.
That's awesome. So a
Thanks.
couple things that you kind of highlighted there that I want to really zero in on. So you talked about a little bit about like the business manager and like the back end. What are some of the roles that are involved in doing podcasting? I know some people are like doing all of those roles, but in an ideal world, if you had a team of people to
Mhm.
produce or to put on a podcast, what are those different roles that, students should know?
Yeah, there's so many, but I'll try to really focus on some of the most important. And I think if somebody were to ask me, okay, I'm ready to unload some of these responsibilities, where do I start? I think the first thing I would say is getting yourself a virtual assistant. I think every podcast and podcaster could use one of those, even if it's just to be a collaborative partner. But I think that a virtual assistant can really take some of the load off for you and handle a lot of the little tasks that just feel like they get in the way, right? But otherwise, I would say there can be lots of hats and lots of roles. An editor is probably one of the most popular, or at least most needed. Sometimes people avoid editors because it's usually one of the bigger expenses, because
Mhm.
you're asking a person to spend probably anywhere from 1 to, who knows, 5 hours on a project, depending on what it is. So I would say that would be probably the next step. And I think a graphic designer would probably be another one. A lot of podcasters just do their stuff on their own, their graphics. They'll use something like Canva,
Yeah.
and it's great. I mean, I do that as well, but having a graphic designer to do that stuff for you is helpful, because a lot of us go into podcasting to podcast, not to become graphic designers and editors and all of the things. So I think those would be the main areas. And ideally, if you've got a budget for it, ideally a producer, somebody that can come in there and really help you shape your show, much like a producer would do for a TV show or a radio show, so that it doesn't all land on the podcaster's shoulders. Because we just talked about this on my podcast, where there's this term that gets thrown around in this industry called pod fade. A lot of people start their podcast. Let me give you a specific example. This year, 2024, in January, there was a roughly 25,000 new podcasts that came to life that started in January. By the end of February, already 30% of the people had quit. Done.
Wow.
And I think, and I believe a lot of that, among other things, but I think a lot of that is that they don't realize how much work is involved in it, or how many different roles they're going to have to play if they're intending on doing it all themselves. But
Right.
yeah, so I would say those are probably the biggest, most helpful roles in a podcast
Because
production.
some of the tasks that we're talking about is like figuring out, I think it goes past like figuring out the length and the frequency and topics, right? Like that's kind of surface level stuff, but actually planning the actual episode, determining if you're going to have guests or if it's going to be just you.
Mhm.
Anything else that is kind of contributing to that workload besides like graphics?
I think, well, sure, yeah. I mean, like you said, the planning is big. And as you probably know, there are a lot of podcasts out there that are interviewing people, right? And
Yeah.
so that in itself, finding guests
Mhm.
and finding the right kind of guests, and
Yeah.
then going through that, it's like dating. I mean, there's a company out there called Podmatch, and Podmatch is like any one of these dating apps. The only difference is you can't actually swipe left or right, but it's essentially
Oh,
the
okay.
same thing, where it's matching people up, right? But it's a lot of work. So that's another one. And there are, including Podmatch, but there are guest services, guest booking services, again, just like in TV or radio. It's the same kind of roles there. So yeah, I would say that. And of course, marketing, advertising, and promotion is another area that's really needed in podcasting. And a lot of times podcasters have to just take on that role and figure it out themselves. So there's a strong need. In fact, if anything, I think that's the most neglected area when it comes to independent podcasters, is properly marketing and promoting your podcast. They're just, most of the time people think if you build it, they will come, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to put out this podcast. It's going to be amazing and everyone's going to find it. And, I'm sure you and your marketing students know that's not how it works. You got to put the time, the effort, the investment. You got to learn about your audience and figure out where are they? How do we get in front of them? And what's the messaging that's going to make sense to them to want to go and press play on that episode of my podcast?
Right. So I mean that it's podcasting has gotten wildly popular now. Like best practices, advice, like from is it is the interview format the only format? I feel like that's the
Mm.
most common. Like, is that really what's best? Is it just depend on your audience? Like, how do you even decide the length of it and the frequency? And there's so many platforms. Like I hear people say, "Oh, we're available everywhere you can get their podcast." And on the back end, knowing as a marketer, I'm like, man, that's a lot of work. Like to do that and to get that on all those different places. But also, I'm like, I don't even know where to start with the length aspect. Because if we think about like social media, we say attention spans like 1 to 2 minutes, if that.
Yeah.
So how do you decide how long a podcast should be and the frequency and knowing like what's going into this? Is every week too soon? Is every
Yeah.
month too far? Like how do you decide some of those things?
Yeah, great question. I think that when we talk about frequency first, consistency matters more than frequency.
Okay.
Okay, weekly is common. That seems to be the common thing. My show is daily. I do it every Monday through Friday. So, and again, talking about my original passions, I do it as a morning show. It's for
Okay.
content creators. I do it every morning, Monday through Friday. But what's consistency doesn't have to mean every day or every week, in my opinion. I'd prefer a high quality podcast that comes out every few weeks or once a month than a lower quality one that's coming out every day or every week. Just be sure to pick something in the schedule that's clear and easy for the audience to remember, right? So for example, you tell your audience, new episode every first Tuesday of the month, right? I don't care what that frequency is, or I should say, I don't care what that consistency is, as long as you figure out that frequency and stick to that,
Okay.
right? And then as far as length, I always joke about it, but because that's a common question I get. How long should this, somebody hires me and they're like, okay, well, how long should my episodes be? And my answer is tongue in cheek, but really kind of serious too. It's as long as you can deliver quality content. I don't care if it's a 2 hour episode, as long as I know that that's actually really highly engaging content that my audience is going to be craving and they're going to want to wait. That's why Joe Rogan does so well. That's why he's the #1 podcaster and does a 3 hour podcast in most cases. It's because his content's engaging and he knows what his audience enjoys and he just delivers it and delivers it. Now, all that said, realistically, I usually tell people aim for 20 to 40 minutes
Okay.
as far as each episode. And I think that for the most part, that we can give just the right amount, because ultimately I do look from a business perspective. I look at podcasts as part of a funnel, a sales funnel, right? And it's kind of at the top in some ways, because if you can give just enough information in that 20 to 40 minutes to give people actionable advice or tips or what have you, enough, but probably ultimately when you give a piece of advice to solve one problem, then that person solves it, and then new problems come up, right? And that's where they're going to say, okay, this person helped me get past problem number 1, now I got problem number 2 I got to figure out. And oh yeah, that's right, they talked about on their podcast that they have a course all about this stuff. I'm going to go buy that course. And that's where the funnel system starts to come into play. So I think if you can just high level, 20 to 40 minutes, talk about the problem, talk about the solution, and maybe offer another solution like a course or a workshop or a webinar, something like that, that you can continue to build through that ecosystem.
Okay, awesome. That's great. In regards to high quality, is that
Mhm.
talking about the content that you're delivering and the value of the information that you're sharing or the interview or the interviewee? or is that production value, or is it a combination of both?
It's a combination of everything, really, because, first of all, audio quality is probably one should probably be one of your top priorities after the content itself, because more people will stop engaging with your content if it's bad audio than if it's bad video,
Okay.
right? As long as if the audio is high quality and they can consume the information, even if the video doesn't look the best, if it's a Zoom type quality video, it doesn't matter as much because they can still consume it. And there are plenty of studies that prove that. So
Okay.
I would say that's a big area, but I believe if I'm going to be putting out high quality audio, then I want, of course, my content to be high quality, and I want high quality video as well. I think if you want to leverage your podcast to be above and beyond, then go all in and deliver high quality from all angles.
Awesome. Now, some platforms only offer audio and then some offer both, or is that
Hmm. Hmm.
so YouTube Play?
So yeah, YouTube offers both, but if you may not know this, but just recently, over the past year or two, YouTube has finally started embracing audio only podcasts.
Hmm.
So you can actually go play in one of their players. You can play an audio podcast. It'll just have that static picture there, but you can hook up your podcast the way you hook it up to Apple and Spotify. Now you can do that to YouTube too. But
Okay.
you will have to do with YouTube right now, if you have a video version, you actually have to create
Hmm.
a separate video, and it doesn't live with the podcast. It's kind of two separate animals all within the same channel. So it's a little confusing, but again, like I said, YouTube, it is newer to this part of it. So I'm sure it's going to evolve over time. And then there's Spotify. So Spotify was welcoming a lot of audio podcasts, and just recently they've really gone all in on video because they're seeing from their users that more people are engaging with video podcasts than the audio ones. So now you can share to Spotify, you can upload your content as video if you choose. I always tell people, even if you want to do audio only, that's fine. Like, we can make that work. But I still encourage them to put a camera on them and on their guest if they have guests, because that's content you can use in other places, like social media being a big platform for organic growth. Yeah, you want to still capture that video because it's going to do a heck of a lot better on TikTok if it's video than if it's just a static picture with some audio playing. People aren't gonna stop on that scroll for just some audio in most cases. So yeah,
Right.
I think yeah, you have that option to do audio or video, and video is becoming more and more popular in this space and more encouraged.
So, from an execution perspective, do you advise that they try to be on all of these different places of YouTube podcasts and Spotify and Apple? Like, is that necessary, or can you be on one place and then just send your audience to that one place?
I don't believe anything is necessary, but I do think it will help to be on all the different platforms where it's available, because some people go to one platform versus another, and we want this to be out there to be exposed to as many people as possible. So I would say strategically, it's a great move to be on these different platforms. I think that if you're doing it on your own, if you haven't built that team out yet, that can sometimes feel overwhelming. But the beautiful part about it all is that to be on any of these platforms, you actually need a third party platform.
Okay.
And the way I explain this, they're called podcast hosting platforms.
Mhm.
And what it is it's basically like a distribution center. So think about a distribution center and think about my episodes that I deliver to my distribution center. And then the distribution center is connected to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all of them. And I can schedule the podcast on that third party platform. And then when it goes live, it gets shot out to all of those different platforms.
Okay.
So it's really important to actually know what third party platform you're picking, because those platforms will, in many cases, automatically do that stuff for you. You
Okay.
don't have to go to each individual app. Well, some cases, I like Apple and Spotify, you might still have to go and do a couple of things, but all these other platforms out there for podcasting, it just instantly will send it out. You just kind of go into the platform and click which ones you want to distribute to, and then it does the rest for you.
Okay, got it. And then when we talking about like quality, is it, I know there's a option where you can just hop on a Zoom or a Microsoft Teams, but there are other options for like the filming of it, right? And you were
Yeah.
telling me about one of them you were going to show us, right?
Yeah, and that just reminded me also, I want to there is something I wanted to get back to. You had asked me about interview formats,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Like, is that really the, is that the only one? Well, first of all, the top genre in podcasting right now is true crime, and those are not interview always. Some of them can be, but they're not. More of them, if we think about, the one that really kicked off this genre, a serial, right? That one, it's more storytelling, right?
Okay.
There's a narrator telling you this story and taking you through it, and then playing sound bites and clips, maybe of an interview or what have you. So I think that is going to be more of what we see in the future in podcasting, is more of the storytelling narrative, because to a point you made earlier, it seems like that's what podcasting is right now. It's just interviews, and it's going to start to get just to become more noise, and people aren't going to, I don't believe, are going to stop getting excited about interviews all the time, because there's just a plethora of them out there, right? So you wanted me to show you,
Yeah.
I'll show you this platform here. Let me pull this out. So this is the platform about interviewing, right? This is like, or even recording on a solo podcast if you wanted to. It's like Zoom, but it's specifically designed for content creators hosting interviews, or doing solo episodes on their own. This is records in, 4K, high quality audio, etc. And it also has a lot of other bells and whistles I'll show you here. So first I gotta find the share button, bear with me. Here we
Oh,
go.
good. I I had a meeting on Teams the other day and I was totally out of my element. Like, I don't know where anything is. Sometimes you have to re-find it, right?
Okay, so do you see it now? Yes, we
You
do.
see it. Yep.
Okay,
Riverside.
so this is called Riverside. Riverside is the one that I use. You can see here, this was one I actually literally had right before you and I hopped on. But you can
Oh,
also see there's some stuff here that I'm using. It's just me on in this
yeah.
camera, and that's me recording social media content for myself, right?
Oh, okay.
But it's great. So basically, what happens is you can have your own studio where you can name it, and if you look here on the left side, I have multiple studios, so I can organize, because I have, for example, I do contract work for this company called Minvo, and they are an AI company that you upload your long form video, and it spits back that video in little isolated clips that you can use for social media, and it's intelligent enough to find engaging clips, right? It's not just picking anything out of the blue. It's actually
Right.
finding clips that you could just turn around and use. Riverside does the same thing as well, by the way. So you could literally record something here. When you're done, you can have it create like 10 clips for you automatically, and it'll also even now edit it for you with AI.
Wow.
So you
Okay.
could press a button and it'll literally do things like cut out long, awkward pauses. It'll cut out filler words, right? Filler words being like, etc. It will it will also allow you to go in and engage with the editing. So if you don't like an edit that it makes, you can do something about it. You can go in and fix it, right? Or you can take something out that you don't like that it kept in, right? So this is Riverside, to me, is the all-in-one solution for podcasters, because it will even generate the episode descriptions, titles, etc. So it's a real game changer for podcasters. And you can see here up at the top, you can, just like Zoom, You can go in and schedule a session, or I could just get an instant link and share it with you right now, and we could go into Riverside together into my personal studio. But
Yeah.
if you go into I'll show you an example of what this looks like, right? So you can give it a session name. So it might say, interview with Mark Ronick, and then just like Zoom, you pick your day, your time. You can invite people. You can choose whether they're the guest. If I have a producer, I can have a producer join, and then the producer, you and I could hear and see them, but they're not being captured on the audio or video,
Okay.
right? So yeah, lots of different things. I could sit here and show you this all day, but I will just show you real quick what the studio looks like, just so you get an idea here. So right now, this is the opening setup screen, and it's checking what am I using here as far as video, audio, and input and output. And it likes to encourage you to use headphones because otherwise a lot of feedback may occur. And then you just join studio, and you can see what it looks like here. If I had a guest, if it was you, you'd be in this box here, the invite people.
Okay.
And you can see I have some control over everything here. I can pick quality, and I can add some noise reduction. So if like I had a fan running in the background here, I could reduce that sound, and you can do some of that in Zoom too. But this is delivering way higher quality content than anything like Zoom would do.
Wow. Okay. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
So, wow. Okay. That's awesome. When you're doing like, so selecting the things and all of the options that you have in a platform like that, is it necessary that I have, like, I see you have a mic and you have earphones, and do you just use a camera on your laptop, or is it
Yeah,
just
great
based
questions.
on, your personal
Hmm.
preference, or is there like a best practice?
Well, okay, so that's a great way to put it. I would say I'll answer this as best practice, because the reality is you can make a lot of things work with very little equipment, right? And again, going back to something I said earlier, I believe delivering the highest quality content you can is important because it is a separator to all the other podcasts that are out there. That said, yeah, I like, for example, the microphone I'm using right now is by Shure, Shure, as you probably can see going across it. And they've been around for years and years. This is called the MV7. It works with a USB, so I could plug it right into my computer. And what I have it plugged into, this is an XLR cable, which delivers higher quality audio usually than a USB connection would. And it's plugged into, I have a little board here that I don't know, maybe I can show it to you a little bit. Yeah, see, here's my
Okay.
board
Like a
right here.
soundboard.
And it's called a Rodecaster Pro. This is the 2 model, and I have it plugged into here. I have my camera plugged into here as well. It's an Elgato Facecam Pro. It's a really high quality streaming camera, and I'm
That's a
also
webcam, not like a camera.
it is
Take.
technically a webcam, but
Okay.
there are very few that deliver in 4K quality. This is one of them. But yeah, a lot of people will use Sony's and other types of cameras. This one is like a $300 camera versus some of those Sony models that you could spend over $1,000 easily on, right?
Right.
Things like lighting, you want to invest a little bit too. And, as I told you earlier, I don't think we did it during the recording, but I'm not in my usual space right now. And I usually have some pretty good lights that are helping to light me up. But what I decided to do instead was, in this office that I'm in, there are 3 huge windows in front of me.
Okay.
And to me, there is nothing better than natural lighting to make a podcast look good, to really capture everything you want to capture. I have a little tiny ring light over here just to add a little bit, but sometimes you can make do with just the windows in your space, right?
Okay.
But you can absolutely, for a lot of content that I make, I actually just use the back of my iPhone,
Mm.
right? So I have an iPhone Pro, so it's got the better quality camera, and people compliment it actually more than this camera that I'm using.
Oh
When
wow.
I'm
Okay.
even on a Zoom, when I'm using my iPhone, the back of the cameras, a lot of time people will stop and just, how do you get it to look so good? So you can make it work with a lot of the technology you probably already have, and I would encourage getting a podcast mic, getting yourself some kind of camera besides your webcam, and get yourself a little bit of lighting if you need it, and go from there. But yeah, it could cost you anywhere from $0 if you're just using your phone for the microphone too, to if I'm being realistic, like with all of this setup, a few couple $1,000.
Got it. Okay. That's great information to note. So getting kind of now we have some background, how do we actually tactically do this? Let's talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about like the business side of podcasting. When we think about like we're not only you love radio and the
Hmm.
podcast area, but there's also a financial component and we want to monetize it. What is that even like? Is that just sponsorships? Like how
Hmm.
does that monetization of podcast work?
Yeah, so that is the traditional way. When I'm talking about like what I did when with that old radio show that ended up hiring me for their podcast, yeah, the biggest way that they were focused on to monetize was through sponsorship, affiliate marketing,
Mhm.
uh, and I actually got them to start selling premium content, meaning paid, people have to pay to listen to it. At the time, I mean, if I could only go back and have recordings of this, I mean, I had to fight tooth and nail for this podcast to actually start charging for some content,
Mm,
because I saw this need. They had, like I was telling you, they were having around like 20,000 downloads per episode and people wanting more. And
mm,
so I said to these guys, like, come on, they want more. And I know you guys don't want to do more because you're putting out this free content other than getting it sponsored or advertised. Why not just get paid to do one extra show? And it's actually to this day, still years later, they're one of their best revenue streams, right? So and now you'll see some platforms that have really embraced that. There's a platform called
mm.
Patreon, and there are similar ones like Buy Me a Coffee is another one. But these are set up for creators to sell content and other stuff, right? Like merchandise, for example. So yeah, that's sponsors, advertisers, affiliate marketing, absolutely. Merch would be another one. And thinking outside of the box, I'm trying to think of some other stuff for you. I think those are the biggest ones, but also live events is a
Hmm.
thing now. A lot of podcasts, once they've built up a little bit of a following, they could go and say, okay, I'm going to be, at whatever coffee shop, or maybe like this show that I've been telling you about. We had so many people that we were doing live shows that were filling up venues of 1,000, 2,000 people, and charging tickets for it and selling merchandise for it, right? There are so many ways that you can monetize it. And here's the one way that a lot of people don't think about, especially when we're talking business. A lot of businesses can do a podcast on that thing that they do. So let's go meta for a second. I have a business for podcasters. So I have a podcast about podcasting, right? It's helping podcasters, talking about a lot of the questions that you're asking me right now. And it's all to, well, not all, but a big part of it is to drive people to hire me, right?
Mm.
To maybe you want me to or my company to edit your podcast, or maybe you want to hire me as your consultant. Well, this is my way of showcasing myself and my knowledge and my expertise. And if the right people who resonate with what I'm saying are going to reach out to me, and I've basically built a business out of that, among other things. But that's a big part of my business, is having a podcast and then offering different ways to purchase my product or service.
Okay, awesome. Great to know. Um, when we're talking about like the planning of things and like the differentiation, if you do an interview style, there's an opportunity for controversial topics to always come up. If you
Yeah.
don't do an interview style, there's still the opportunity for controversial topics to come up. How do you find that balance between freedom of speech and virality of what's happening right now versus cancel culture and controversial topics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're not there. There's no foolproof answer to this, especially with what you just said with cancel culture, because you could say something without the intention of how it was interpreted,
Right.
and you have to deal with that, right?
Yeah.
I think some key points here first is to know your audience,
Okay.
understand who they are and what they value. And I think that really helps. It does for me. It helps me focus on topics that resonate without being unnecessarily provocative, right?
Right.
And there are times too where, with my show, we have audience participation too, right? And sometimes, especially this year, topics around politics comes up, and I don't want to go there. I'm doing a show about podcasting, and it's
Yeah.
hard because now, we saw it, like Donald Trump, he was on the Joe Rogan show, and that made a huge impact on his campaign. Kamala Harris was on Call Her Daddy, right? And that made an impact for her. So it's hard not to talk about it. And I always, the moment it comes up, I usually will call it out, and I'll just say, we're not doing politics right now. Yes, we're talking about how politics are interacting with podcasting, but I am not telling you Donald Trump. I'm not telling you Kamala Harris. I'm just saying this is this is what we're talking about. Here's the actual topic within them that I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and Kamala Harris, she's had a little bit of controversy because she didn't go on the Joe Rogan show. She ended up not doing the show, right? And so again, it's like we had to talk about that without making it seem like we had a bias one way or the other. So it's
Right.
hard. So knowing your audience and calling it out, right? Calling out, like, this is not where I'm going,
Right.
so set clear boundaries, I guess, is really the way to put it. Decide
Yeah.
ahead of time what those topics are that are off limits,
Yeah.
and communicate those boundaries.
And
And I
staying true to it, right?
and staying true to it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think authenticity, I know it's a buzzword. I know a lot of people say it, and it's very near and dear to my heart, especially when it comes to podcasting. The more authentically you are, the more your audience will connect with you. It's those moments where we are forcing stuff and we're doing stuff because we know this is what the majority think or say, and we don't want to push that. That's where things start to feel uncomfortable. That's where you can get dangerous too. So I think the more you are true to yourself, the safer you are from this particular area.
Yeah.
And I think I do a pretty good job as a host staying neutral, talking about what I was just saying a moment ago about politics. I think staying neutral as best you can on topics is important. Focus on presenting facts or different perspectives without taking a strong personal stance that might alienate listeners or offend.
Yeah.
So that's another way. And I know there's a thin line there, because you're trying to be authentic, but being authentic doesn't mean you always have to share every opinion you have,
Right. Yeah.
right?
It's a hard one. It's a hard question. When I saw when I saw it submitted, I was like, "Ugh, that's really hard." It's a hard thing to do. But I think, as marketers, from a podcast perspective, from a branding perspective, it's one of those things that you have to, from my perspective, it's something that you have to plan for. So
Yeah. And
planning
there
of
go
it.
ahead. There's also the other thing is there's always editing, right?
Yeah.
So it's important to take the time to
Mm,
listen through before you put that episode out there, to make sure, with a fresh set of ears, or maybe you have a trusted partner, friend, somebody who could then listen to it and then get their feedback. And maybe somebody will say, "Ooh, I don't like that you guys are talking about that," and then dig into why that is. And then you have that freedom to then edit things out if you think it's going to cause a problem.
yeah. Yeah. I like that. Awesome. Thank you for sharing. I know that
You're
was a
welcome.
kind of a tough question.
It
We talked
is.
a little bit about it, but AI seems to be impacting everything. You highlighted some ways that AI has impacted podcasts already. Where do you see podcasts kind of going in the future, especially when we think about the overlap of AI?
Yeah, where is it heading? So, I mean, I'm going to give you a little bit about, in general, the growth, and I'll throw in some AI. I know for me, AI really helped me with my content creating. In other words, the brainstorming, the ideas, fleshing out those ideas, just literally going into ChatGPT, telling it what I'm thinking about, and then fleshing it out. It's a great way to have that, to have a collaborative partner without having one, right? So it's really helped me out, and I think that is going to continue a lot as the technology advances. I think that yeah, the more and more it does, the more and more easier it is to create content. So I think that we're going to see a bigger and stronger creator economy over the next few years. I think creators, and we can already see it with influencers as well, influencers in many cases are more successful in this space than celebrities, right?
Mm.
Because they know how to connect with that audience, and this is a newer type of way to do it than what the celebrities are used to. So yeah, I think that we'll see a lot of that. I think that we're going to see, with AI, I think that's going to also open more and more to things like AR and VR as that advances. I think we're going to start having more of these interactive podcasts where, I'd be hosting kind of like this, but I could have these goggles on and have my audience literally in front of me, right? So I think we'll see a lot of that. And it's hard for me to even wrap my brain around the different directions that could go. But I know that we will see more AR and VR in our content moving forward. And then, as I mentioned earlier, video podcasting too. I think that's a big one that is going to continue to grow and rise. And I think AI will help that along because, like I said, it's already editing our content for us, and a lot of people, it's hard to learn how to do it yourself. Video editing is super complicated in comparison to audio editing. So a lot of podcasters get into it doing the audio and then now finding out you really need to do video too, and it's a whole beast in itself. So having technology like AI do it for you, I think that's going to open a lot of doors for a lot of people in this space.
Yeah, I was video editing about 20 years ago is when I started video editing, or
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 22 years ago. And now it's like I use Captive Captivate,
Captivate. Hmm.
and this push a button and then it's like
Yeah,
render it, and then it's done. And I'm like, wait, what? That's crazy. So
it is.
it's definitely changed a lot. When we think about like, so a lot of these students are going to be coming out and we have an individual brand, but we also work for companies. How do you think companies and brands can differentiate from the consumer or from the individuals doing podcasts? Is there space for businesses to have their own podcast? And what does that look like in your estimation?
Yeah. So I think that actually part of the boom of podcasting is because businesses are starting their podcasts, because
Okay.
they've started to recognize that it really develops a relationship between them and their clients or customers and potential customers. And in most cases, even more so than social media. You can build a huge following on social media, but the connections aren't nearly as deep, as strong as they are in podcasting. Why is that? Because it's long form content and people get to spend some time with you and get to know you. It's not just some random people just dancing on a screen, right? This is deeper. It's more engaging. So you create that space, and then people are going to likely purchase from you. I mean, I wish I had it off the top of my head and I can't remember now, but there have been some studies and some reports that have come out that advertising on podcasts is way more effective these days than television or radio. And the funny part about that is a lot of people's heads then go to, okay, I got to get advertisers, I got to get sponsors. No, just be your own advertiser, be your own sponsor. You're capturing an audience that is specifically interested in the types of products and services you're offering. So yeah, go all in on that. Um, I think that, so yeah, and I think so specifically, how could they differentiate themselves from every other podcast? Because that's the real challenge right now is there's so many podcasts out there. It's like, how do people know whether or not to go check out this business podcast or these two guys doing their hobby podcast, right? I think that again speaks to the content quality from video to audio to the content itself. I think that, that goes to the consistency. I think it goes to making sure you have a as a business you likely have a budget, right? And if you're going to invest in the podcast, make sure that you're going to also earmark a budget for it to promote and advertise it. Yes, you already have this advertising budget for whatever that product or service is, but that's not enough to get them to come check out the podcast. You got to treat it almost like another product within your business, draw that audience in. And again, it's like that funnel. And then they'll start to learn about you, your business, what you offer. And then they're going to be way more likely to make that sale, make that purchase than they would if they just kind of saw you randomly on TikTok.
Okay, that's super interesting. When we talk about like the marketing of your podcast, are we leaning into SEO? Are we trying to promote it on social? Any advice you have for the promotion of a podcast?
Yeah, a lot of podcasters sleep on SEO.
Mm.
So, and it's probably one of the more effective ways to get people to find your podcast. So I would absolutely encourage, yes, to SEO and do all the work to make that work for you. There was something else you said too, and I can't remember besides SEO.
Social.
Social, yeah, absolutely. The problem with social is most podcasters are going into it with the intention of organic growth, and
Mm.
it can work for organic growth, but just like podcasting, it's a little bit of a slow burn, right? You
Mhm.
gotta you gotta build it up, and you gotta kind of wait for that one that's going to go off to start really building up, right? So I think the advantage for a business is to spend money on advertising on those platforms. And I don't mean like boosting your content because on Instagram you can pay extra to have a particular piece of content go out. I mean like taking advantage of Facebook ads, Instagram ads. I spoke to the other day, I did a consult call with these podcasters, two guys, and they started their podcast in 2022. Within a year, they were up to over 100,000 downloads a month, doing a show, I think, once a week. And I asked him, how did you do it? Well, he actually had some marketing experience and he was spending money on Instagram ads. And within a month, he had already built up his audience to over 2,000 people. And he's continued to do that with that very specific niche targeted advertising. And it's built up to what it is now. And so I think that's a big advantage for a business is to put some money into that. And especially if we're talking about social media. I felt like I had one other for you specifically. Oh, the other thing is, is getting on other podcasts as far as promoting.
Mm.
That's another area that people sometimes sleep on is go and find similar podcasts to yours, similar genre that has a similar target audience, and be a guest there because you're in front of an audience, a captured audience that already knows podcasting, already listens to podcasts. It's an easy sell at that point. As long as
Right.
you're delivering as a guest, yeah, they're gonna more than likely at least go check something out that you've done, and then that's where you can hopefully sell them to keep coming back. But yeah, so guesting on as far as organic, being a guest on other podcasts on a regular basis, I think helps a lot.
Nice. Do you think that a podcast, so if it's an individual person or if it's a brand that has a podcast, do you think that podcast needs its own dedicated set of social media accounts and dedicated website and all of that for the podcast separate from the brand, or should it be folded up into the brand?
I think that depends on the messaging. So if
Mm,
your podcast is truly aligned with the other content you're making on your current account, for example, then by all means just keep it there, right? But we learn that if we start to stray a lot from the usual content, we're going to start losing people.
mm,
And then none of your content gets consumed, right? So I think I'm still on the fence, quite frankly. Yes, my own podcast, I do have a separate account, and it doesn't do nearly as well as my main account, right? And it's okay for, like, I could probably get away with not having a separate account because all of my content's constantly podcasting, but I don't want to pigeonhole myself in case I pivot sometime, right? And if I still may want to do my morning show, and I still may want to promote it, but I may have other interests in my main account. I may want to go in a different direction. So it's really more of a strategic move down the road for me. But yeah, I guess at the end of the day, talking this through with you, I would say having separate accounts are good. What I like to do is, like Instagram, I have those separate accounts, and then I just do that collaboration feature so that it's going to appear on both platforms, on both profiles.
yeah, I think they did really good when they added that one. They've
Yeah,
been
me too.
adding
I
some
wish more
features.
had it.
Yeah, they've been adding some features, and I'm like, why? But I
Yeah.
think that one was a really good one.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed.
so you've said some stuff a little here and there about like number of downloads. What other metrics should we be looking for to really tell us if this is a success or not?
Yeah, great question. And downloads, unfortunately, the reason why that's such a focus is because for so long that's been almost the only metric that podcasters get.
Oh,
It's
okay.
changing. It's changing, especially now that we're putting our content on YouTube, but it's changing now. And I think that the stat that I like to focus on the most is retention rate,
Mm,
right? Because look, downloads is great, but really all that's saying is that somebody downloaded that episode to their phone,
yeah.
right? That's all it's saying. We don't know if they played it, right? So yeah, it's great. It looks good that, yeah, okay, we got X number of downloads, but if no one's listened to it, no one listening to it, it's never going to grow. And you got to figure out why. So how do you figure out why? The retention rate. Where are you losing people? And I know TikTok does this too, and so does Instagram and a lot of the others. You can see where are people dropping off, and then start to focus on that, right? Like, okay, so 20 minutes into the episode, or maybe it's an hour episode, I'm losing people. What's happening 20 minutes in, right?
Mm,
Maybe it's the questions I'm asking, maybe it's the guests, maybe, whatever. You can start digging into what's happening there. And the ultimate goal for me and for my clients is, if they're listening to 80-85% or more of the episode, I think you're in good shape. That helps you grow. You can promote a lot of things. You can really get your messaging out there. So yeah, I would say look at that, pay attention to that number, and make adjustments accordingly.
okay, awesome. So to that point, maybe we've been doing a podcast, we're following your advice, so we're super consistent. We post something, let's say every other week, where it's a bi-weekly podcast, and it's 45 minutes long, and we're noticing people drop off at 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Is there, oh, do you create a whole, so you say, okay, this obviously isn't working, either we're too frequent or the duration isn't really hitting for our target audience? How do you pivot at that point? Do you just kind of announce it and then change it, or do you have to scrap that whole podcast and start anew? Like, how do you adjust setting that expectation for your audience and then adjusting what you're doing to try to make it more successful?
I personally, for myself, and what I tell others is, yeah, if you're making a change that you feel is significant, or you feel like your audience is going to think it's significant, talk about it. Again, this is developing the relationship between you and the audience. So talk about it. Tell them why. Tell them, yeah, I'm noticing that I'm losing my audience, And let's use one of your examples. I'm noticing I'm losing my audience 20 minutes in, and I've asked a lot of you why I'm losing you 20 minutes in, and you're telling me you don't have any more time to spend on the episode. A great example is if you're doing a podcast that you're where your target audience are doctors, right? A lot of times doctors don't have more than 20 minutes to just sit and listen to something, right? And a lot of people will deliver an hour and a half show and then wonder what's going on. Well, that's a perfect example, a perfect way of taking advantage of those retention rates and doing something about it. But yeah, communicate it. And you don't always have to pivot. I would say the times you would want to pivot into an entirely new podcast is if you've recognized this content isn't working, right? Like people aren't interested in it, right? And so you got to find one of your other passions to talk about, or do something different. But yeah, if you're going to end up appealing to an entirely different audience, I would recommend starting from scratch, because there's no sense in delivering this content to people that probably won't care about it, meaning using your existing podcast. That audience isn't interested. So yeah, start fresh, start over. And I think that's also helpful for the podcaster to do too, because they have that clean slate. They can put that other one to bed and then move forward.
Yeah. So in your estimation, we talked a little bit about it, high quality, that consistency. Is there anything else that you would add to the list that kind of separates the successful one from the unsuccessful podcast? Anything else you'd add there?
You know what I think the biggest difference, the biggest separator is the podcasts that actually put intention behind their podcast, the ones that have a strategy, the ones that are constantly shifting because they've seen either a change in the numbers or they're receiving a ton of feedback from their audience. That's to me, yeah, that's where I think makes you different from the rest, is really having that strategy, knowing what you're doing, really digging into who your audience is, what are they struggling with, and how are you going to help serve them, right? And this is specifically for businesses. This is where I think you can really shine. So yeah, that would be my answer.
Awesome. Good to know. Any skill that you think would help somebody be more successful in podcasting that they could hone or practice or build up or research, anything that you say, if you want to do podcasting, you want to be successful, you need this skill.
Effective communication skills,
Mm.
knowing how to listen, when to listen, and to listen, right? In other words, there are a lot of interviews that I hear where the podcaster has their questions and all they're focused on is waiting to ask the next one. And they're not paying attention to the guest, and the guest is probably dropping lots of nuggets in there that probably need more explanation, and they're not stopping, because you've done a great job at
No,
this,
thank you.
where you stop. Like, I know you have your canned questions, but you've also steered away from that script, and you're following up, you're asking me follow-up questions, and too many people fail to do that. So yeah, I think
Got it.
that's definitely it.
That's good. That's great advice. So just a couple more questions. When
Sure.
we are planning this, like, are there any planning documents? Are there any, like, do you actually script it out and say, like, I'm gonna say this and then I'm gonna say this, knowing that we'll kind of go with the flow? How much do you plan ahead of time? Is there a document or a flow that you can recommend? Like, hey, if you're gonna do a podcast, it's gonna be this kind of podcast. Try to go with some of this, or try to do some of these things before as you plan.
Yes, and I have something that I can give to you that you can hand off to the students.
Oh,
Yes.
awesome.
Um, I think, look, I think there are lots of ways to do this, and I'm trying to think it through here. So basically, you're asking me really is like what's involved in the planning or how much planning? I want to try to get clarification on that.
More so like what's involved in the planning. So we talked a little bit about like the different roles. If a student was going to say like, hey, graduating from Vanderbilt with my master's in marketing. I really, really like this digital marketing strategy thing. I want to create my own podcast to really go in go in more depth
What's
and
the resource?
tell the work.
Uh-huh.
Like, how do they don't have a producer, they don't have a virtual assistant. Like, even if they did hire a virtual assistant, what are the details that the virtual assistant should do? Like, how do they
Mm,
actually go about putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboards to say, like, this is how I'm planning it, outside of those fun, like, branding, cool little cute things, like, oh, I'm gonna name it this. Like, how do they
yeah.
what do they start?
Yeah, I think I know I feel like a broken record, but again, it's really first narrowing down what do you want to talk about and who's interested in that, right?
Mm,
Who's that audience? Because if you don't do that, then everything else just becomes stress, right?
yeah.
You got to really understand what you're doing, and then look, I would say the first answer I'll give you is come to me. I'm happy to help you. I do free consult sessions all the time. There are plenty of podcasts, whether it's mine or others, that teach these
Mm,
things. YouTube and TikTok University has plenty of information over there as well. Ultimately, I think that a big strategy that you could use going into it is not only plan your content ahead of time. Like one of the first things I do with my clients is when they're ready to go, it's like, all right, before we do anything, I want you to list out 20 different topics that you think you're going to be able to talk about at length on your podcast. Because a lot, and what happens a lot of times is they get to, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, and then they're like, oh, I got to come up with more now, right?
yeah.
And the
Mhm.
truth of the matter is if you're going to do this every week, yeah, you do. Now, of course, you can repurpose, you can revisit content all the time, but you still need to plan ahead that way and then record as many of those episodes as you can before you even launch, as
Yeah.
we call it, batch recording. So
Yeah.
get as many. I tell my clients, like I just launched a podcast a couple weeks ago for a client, and I did not let her launch until she had 10 episodes recorded. I don't do
Mm,
that with every client, but I do know certain clients need that padding because if they don't, they're going to get behind, and then that consistency factor is out the window, right? So not only plan ahead, but record ahead, edit ahead, get everything way ahead so that when life happens,
yeah.
you can keep putting out that content and not worry about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great advice. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts you want to share and things you want the students to know for sure?
I would say, yeah. I mean, look, the strategy for podcasting isn't terribly different than social media, right?
Mm,
So if you've got the knowledge, experience, etc., in that arena, it can easily be applied to this one. It's just the biggest difference is long versus short, right?
okay.
But I that would be one thing, and then of course, yeah, go come check out my show in the mornings,
Yeah.
or it's a podcast as well. I do it live and then I put it out as a podcast, and yeah, be a part of our community, and if not, find a community as well, because there are the podcaster community has been amazing. I used to avoid it at all costs because I used to kind of be, I guess I was kind of full of myself, like, well, I don't need to meet other
Mm,
podcasters. I don't need to learn from other podcasters. I know what I'm doing. But once I finally pushed myself to do it, I learned how accepting and collaborative they are, how willing they are to help other podcasters who are starting out. It's a really amazing community that I would encourage anyone to be a part of if they want to go down this road. Yeah.
awesome. Great advice for podcasting, great advice in general. You never know all the things. Tapping into your network, tapping into other people that do it as well is a surefire way to make sure you stay current and you have a community that helps you. So you say, like, hey, nobody's responding. Am I crazy? Like, what's happening here? Somebody else to throw stuff off the throwing things against the wall with. It's always great.
Yeah.
So where can the students find you to follow your podcast?
Sure. So it's called the Podcasting Morning Chat. So you could certainly search for that anywhere. Otherwise, you can find it at podpage.com/PMC. And my business website is actually, I'm going to give you two: ironickmedia.com, and that's IRONICK, Or you can check out nextgenpodcaster.com. So next, GEN podcaster. That is a community we've built up that specifically helping podcasters integrate AI into what they do, help them figure out what are the best ways I can use AI to help me and stay true to myself, true to my content, not make it sound robotic at the same time or be robotic at the same time. So we work with podcasters on that kind of stuff as well. So any one of those, please check it out and send me some feedback to let me know what you think.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
You're
And
welcome.
he is on LinkedIn as well. So build those networks. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Appreciate it.